first place. You see, every time we get together and we come and we have this remembrance service where we take this cup and we take this bread and we enter in all reverence, we are proclaiming to the world today, Christ is coming again. But see, here comes the problem. The church in Corinth didn't get that. They were so lost in trying to hold to their own rights in faith, so lost in their own ways of trying to walk this line with one foot in the holiness, one foot in the world, that they were not walking a tightrope, but they looked like someone who was drunk, stumbling here and about and not making much of a difference. I believe it was Brother Dan who on Sunday, because I watch his sermons to know exactly where to springboard from, I believe it was Brother Dan who said that people were getting drunk and they were just so lost in their own culture that they didn't know what was Christian worship and what wasn't anymore. And so that is a problem. Why? I just read to you a snippet from Hebrews that tells you why. Because we have a great faith with a great cloud of witnesses before us, and hopefully those who will come after us that will join in that cloud later, as we look into how God is working in the lives of the church. Now, I have to say it that way for this reason. We, when we come together to pray, to sing praises, to study the Word, and to observe the ordinances, baptism and the Lord's Supper, we are the church. This building, it could crumble down tomorrow before we come to the office to work. This is not the church. This is just a worship center. But even if we were here across the street on Briscoe Lot, under the stars, under the midday sun, for one reason, because our heart is set on worshiping the living God. And see, that is something that the church in Corinth was missing. They had so diluted their practice of worship. They had compromised their lifestyle of holiness to such a degree. Why would anyone become part of the church? Do you remember? I mean, if you do just a cursory flipping of your pages back and you go back a few pages, you're going to see in your headers in the different versions of Scripture that divisions in the church. We're following the teachers. We're not following the Christ. Then you come and you see that Christ is proclaimed crucified. And then there's wisdom from the Spirit. But again, we come back to divisions. And then if you go then to chapter 4, the ministry of the apostles is being put into question and doubt. And then we have a couple in the church where sexual immorality is not only being condoned, but some people are applauding it. Does this sound like a healthy church? It is not. Why? Because people have misplaced their eye. They are looking to how they can enjoy the benefit of a glorious faith here in the world and not preparing for that which is to come. Not preparing for meeting God face to face. Can you imagine that moment? Even better, chapter 6, there's disputes in the courts between believers and it causes dissension. Then there's more sexual immorality, and then there's issues with marriages. And then he reminds them, you need to live as you were called. And then we get into what more recently we've been covering. For example, how the widows were misbehaving because their immoral lifestyle and based on their misunderstanding of who God is and how it makes a difference in their lives. And then you have the food offered to idols. Do you remember that? What we see here is a church that is trying to be so much like the world that they have forgotten what it means to be a holy church. And my hope is that not only here in Divine Texas, but even all throughout the United States, that we would not come to a divided table. That's what was happening in Corinth. The table was divided. The church wasn't one, it was two. And what's worse, it was in the most shameful way, in multiple levels. For one, when people came together, the people who, as you would call them, the haves, they would come early because it's easy to manage a portfolio of holdings. In those days, you may go and see how your fleet of ships is doing at port. You may then go to your vineyard for the late morning and maybe see how the grapes are growing, how is the wheat or the barley. And then you would go and see how your slaves are taking care of everything that's going on in all of your places, in your home and in your businesses. And then leisurely you may come and say, well, I'm a Christian. It's time to come to the Lord's table. And you would get together and you would come not to what we are accustomed today, where it's just a little cracker or a little wafer and a cup of juice, but it would be a feast, a beautiful feast, something that Brother Dan also addressed. Imagine how shameful it is that even Christian men were following the customs of banqueting back in those days, not making a distinction between a business meal, as you would, and the Lord's table. But you see, that was one portion of the church at the time, and we still have people today in church who are wealthy. Take this to heart. Not just you who are wealthy, but everyone. Then there was this division where you had the poor. The people who would get up from sun up and they would go to the fields outside of town and work the fields, or they would go to their indentured servant masters and they would say, well, I'm here to work. Where am I going today? And they would go and labor. But their labor was not done until late in the day, typically when the sun was going down. So what happens when you have people who